Okay, I'm sure some others will join alongside. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our today's kind of open heart conversation about finance for good. It's really fantastic to be here together with Phyllis Constanza and Dolly Kabanda, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. It's actually more supposed to be an engaged conversation soon. Just setting the scene, we just here, not very far from where I am, we've just seen like the G7 meeting end. In a way, Gordon Brown, who previous UK Prime Minister and Global Envoy for Youth Education, and who has been one of the key figures also behind establishing the Education Outcomes Fund, called it an unforgivable moral failure. Strong words, but you know, the plan, I know I've seen the headlines with 1 billion vaccines, etc., which look good, but we all know that actually we need 11 billion vaccines to vaccinate the world, and that we will only all be free of fear once we are all free of fear, because we know what it means that these things can mutate, can come back, can hurt us. So there is not only a moral, I think, imperative, there is also an economic and social imperative to get there. So in this backdrop of a G7 that potential, I mean, some people talk about we live in a G0 world at the moment where global leadership is not really being pushed, where there is America first, China first, India first, etc. first, while the challenges we have with the SDGs actually need much more partnership and global partnership. Just to remind, behind the COVID crisis, we have a very big silent pandemic, which many people here and the attendees I've seen are working on, which is the learning crisis. In the next few years, we'll have 400 million girls which are going to be either not at school or leaving school without learning. And that's 260 million children already now who are not in education. And that's just one of the SDG examples. And the question is, how are we going to solve this? You know, and what is the right financial model to solve this? And that's what I'd love to discuss today, both in terms of good examples, but what are the obstacles and challenges to move us from a lot of talk to a lot of action. And just to take the first question, which we'll address in a second to Phyllis, I want to put two numbers out there. During the pandemic crisis, during the COVID pandemic, 150 million more people are now in deep poverty, which means they don't have enough food to eat. And in that same time, actually a study from UBS, the Swiss bank, had showed that the super rich have increased their wealth by more than a quarter, by 27.5%, from I think 7-something trillion to 10.2 trillion with the T, you know. And I'm not taking any moral stand here. I'm thinking about the whole economic and social destruction that this inequality is creating. We are at the level of wealth inequality of 1905, which kind of, I think, is really an important number to look at. And the question is, how can we, everyone is talking about these trillions in the capital market and how we can use them to solve, you know, social and developmental challenges. And so that's what we're going to discuss today as well. So welcome, Phyllis Constanza, who is lead of UBS at Society, or in Society, and also the CEO of UBS Optimus Foundation. And welcome, Dolly Kabanda, who's a director of CDC, is global ambassador of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, and both of them have also an active role in our board. And so I'll start with you, Phyllis. You've been one of the few people, I think, in this world for me who have been doing a lot of action and little talk, maybe. So much, much more action and walk than talk about using really our big financial system to solve societal and development challenges. Why are you doing this? Tell me, why are you doing this, and some examples of what you're doing.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for joining this conversation. And you're right, wealth inequality has been exacerbated right now, and you know, it's not something that's new, although it's gotten much worse. And the reason UBS has gotten into this space at all, I mean, originally UBS set up this foundation 20 years ago to help our clients with their philanthropy, which is quite unique for large financial institutions. Usually they don't have an entity where clients can actually execute through that entity, execute their philanthropy. They'll, all banks offer advice, but very few actually help clients execute. And the reason that we did this is because clients don't know how to make an impact. And we know that more than 90% of our large clients give philanthropically, but based on our research, fewer than 20% of them are satisfied with their impact. So we wanted to create mechanisms that put the impact back in impact investing and that have an impact first priority. So we launched the first development impact bond in education about 6-7 years ago in India with Educate Girls. And really, I mean, what success for us looks like a change in how people think about driving social impact. And that would mean that all other financial institutions are doing this. They're taking risks, investing in things that are truly impact driven and not greenwashing, which we are seeing a lot of. If you dig deep into some impact investing funds, you see things like vaping companies in there. You see, fossil fuel companies, coal mining plants, things that it would be very difficult to justify the impact they're making. So we really want to emphasize how important the actual measurable impact is. And that's why we got into this in the first place.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Phyllis. We'll come back to more examples later. Before I move to Dolika, I wanted to ask all attendees to put questions in the Q&A box. We will have, I think, another 20 minutes or so of conversation, and then we'd love to really engage with many of you. So if you have comments, you can also write in the chat, but please put in some questions in the Q&A box, and then my colleague Luna will reach out to you, and if you agree, bring you in live here to join our conversation. So Dolika, to you. So you've been also a force of nature in all, development finance and trying really kind of to bring more, kind of walk to the talk, both in your role at CDC, as GSC, and other roles. So can you tell me about how do you see this happening at the moment? What is your take on what development finance is doing? And I know you're very passionate also about, young people and employment. And I want to put a number out there. In 2035, our continent, our continent of African continent, will have reached a 1 billion workforce. That's kind of 5,000 days from now. Yeah. And so all these people will need to be in meaningful employment if we don't want a more massive migration, refugee, etc., societal crisis. So the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Amel, and thanks for having me together with Phyllis, which I think is an incredible conversation, and look forward to many more of these very important and timely conversations. I think I have been fortunate enough and privileged enough to have a unique role in terms of interacting with financial intermediaries, including DFIs, IFC and CDC, for over 30 years. And I have seen them transform from mono-lens, hard-nosed financial return bankers, and I think we heard it from Phyllis, to now embracing their catalytic role towards responsible, outcomes-based, and impact-focused investing for the greater good. And you mentioned the employment numbers, you referenced Africa. But beyond Africa, I think the numbers are not much different. So globally, 50% of the population of the world is going to be women by 2030. And about 60% of that is going to be youth. And you can categorize youth from 25 and below or 35 and below. But these are real numbers that are facing us. In people numbers, we're talking about in excess of 2 billion people that we need to focus on bringing into the inclusive market. And we're all talking about COVID now, but I want this conversation to be beyond COVID. COVID merely highlighted the fractures in an already existing disparate system. And so we need to focus on how do we use this opportunity, leverage where we are now, and I know we'll talk about it later, to make sure that we rebuild. And as human beings, I heard this morning on an investment call that we have an incredible capacity to be resilient, an incredible capacity to recover, an incredible capacity to address the global challenges that have always faced us historically. But now I think the focus has got to be on inequality, on poverty, on unemployment, on making this an inclusive society. And I see this through the DFIs and the investment world in which I sit, with examples of really innovative approaches to finance. So it's finance plus, plus, plus. I see it with the GSG, the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, of which EOF is a baby. I see it through the global conversation we have with the National Advisory Boards. I see it through CDC as a leader amongst DFIs with the 2X challenge, billions of dollars put aside for gender-lens investing. I see it with the donors creating an African risk capacity insurance company for resilience against climate change. So it is coming at us in many, many different ways. But I think what we need to focus on in each of our societies in order to address this issue of inclusiveness and growth for all is looking at hard infrastructure for regional integration wherever we're sitting, soft infrastructure for global inclusivity, investments in climate resilience for the most vulnerable, and investments in women and youth-focused interventions. And I see that group of four positions, Amal, as a great way of us making a step towards making this a more impactful world in which we operate, regardless of whether we are financiers, social investors who are also financiers, small investors, large investors. I think this is where I get excited about it, actually, because I think we're at a good place to be having this conversation.
That's fantastic, fantastic. I want to ask you both like a bit of a provocative question, because, you know, the examples we talk about, from Educate Girls to these kind of, you know, financial, you know, kind of tools, etc. You know, if I was in a critical stance, I would say all these are kind of small and pilots. You know, on the one side, we're talking about 2 billion young people entering the job market, you know, and then we're finding solution for a few hundred and few thousand, you know. When I have conversation, I just want to share two conversations with two kind of friends. The one who's raising money for infrastructure projects in Africa, and he tells me, yeah, Larry Fink, you know, BlackRock may write these wonderful letters about invest, but when I go to the investment committees, their expectation of return and etc. financial returns hasn't changed by a bit. The way they make decisions, how they incentivize hasn't changed by a bit. Another friend from Tunisia, you know, who's you know, kind of creating a renewable energy project, wanted to get some funding from CDC, took them kind of 5,000 hoops and loops and so many years of due diligence until they get there. And so in a way, are we talking a lot and doing very little? And these nice pilot and kind of examples, I'm being exactly provocative, are just kind of a bit of a marketing blurb and PR thing, but that actually 99.99% of finance is just about, you know, the hard capitalism that is sadly actually not working today for most of humanity. Who wants to go first? And what are the obstacles? Why are we not kind of in the billions and trillions? Why are we on these small projects?
Yeah, I think you're right. We are working on the margins right now. And, you know, the thing that I always say to you, and what we say it all the time, is this is, you know, what we're doing now is not the thing, but it is the thing to the thing. We are hoping to get to a point where we can scale these instruments. And that's why I said in the beginning, you know, for us, success would look would mean that other financial institutions are starting to do this. And so there's a way to get there, and a way to get there is through increased transparency. When people talk about driving impact, when financial institutions talk about driving impact, we need to show what exactly we mean and what impact are we actually driving. So it's not just about setting up a fund. And the EU and the UK and Switzerland is actually moving quite aggressively in demanding greater transparency to mitigate this risk of greenwashing. But it's clear we need a lot more money to go towards these issues. And we need financial institutions to take more risk when it comes to addressing the greatest need. You know, what Dolika said earlier about this tremendous population because of the demographic dividend in Africa who's going to be employable, we can either, you know, over the next 10 years, see the greatest poverty we've ever seen in the history of the world if we don't enable these people to work, or we could see the greatest prosperity we've ever seen. And we're really sitting at a crossroads right now. So I would say we are suffering from a little bit too much talk and a little too little action, as Elvis Presley says, but although he says it much better than I just said it. But hopefully we'll start to see more. And I think one of the reasons is financial institutions are so regulated, we're afraid to take risk. And, you know, I can tell you, even getting through some of these small deals at UBS, who is so open to doing this, it is not easy. You know, we've got to deal with our compliance teams, our risk teams, our legal teams. I mean, and we're trying to set up now a large fund, you know, in the 200 million, which is still not big enough, but we're getting there. And it is complicated. So you need people who are willing to persevere and work through this, and hopefully we can simplify it. But we know that we don't have to deliver whatever market rate returns are. You know, I don't even know what that term means anymore, because we're getting now, we've done about 8 of these deals, and we're seeing around, on average, around a 7% return, which just sounds pretty good to me. Now, granted, it's higher risk, so, you know, maybe we should expect more, but we're really addressing some of the poorest people in the most remote places. And we know from other research UBS has done that millennials, women, more than half of them, almost 2/3 actually, are willing to take a reduced return for measurable impact. And we cannot forget that. And especially now when the wealthy's income, you know, when the wealthy's wealth has grown by 25% during this time, and the poorest has dropped by probably a lot more than that, everybody has to step up. And, you know, we need to tap into that population that's willing to take a lower return.
Before I go to you, Dolika, can I ask you, Phyllis, so you're saying you'd like other financial institutions to do the same. You talked a bit about the obstacle. It's hard to do, let's say, you know. We always know that doing something new is hard and regulation, etc. So what is the secret magic potion that you have? Like, what is the secret? Why could you at UBS kind of be one of the front runners here? How can other copy what you've done?
Because we had leadership at UBS who was committed to this. And this really has to come from the top. You know, at the time we did this, the CEO of UBS was the chair of our board. And so we went to him and said, hey, we want to do this. This is really important for society. If we're committed to addressing issues around inequality, then we have to step up and do this. And he was really committed. And our current CEO, we have a new chair of the foundation now, Suni Harford, who's also the president of asset management at UBS. And she's extremely committed. That's where it has to come from. And, you know, and I have to call on those people all the time, because I'll have somebody in a compliance function who might say, and rightly so, this is their job, you know, ooh, this is too risky. You're investing in, you know, in rural communities in Liberia, anything could go wrong. You know, we understand that. And so I often have to call in the senior people to say, hey, we're willing to do this. We're willing to take this risk. And that's what it needs. It needs really senior support. And then it needs a really strong team who knows how to execute this. And, you know, we've also got that. We've got more than 70 people around the globe who are experts in philanthropy and social finance dedicated to this work.
Fantastic. No, thank you, Phyllis. Thank you. I mean, Dolika, we've heard from Phyllis this really important role of leadership and champions to push this. But I think we can't probably wait for everywhere to have these kind of champions and leaders. And so the question is, I know you're very passionate also about policymakers and, you know, the role of policymakers to push kind of to move the needle in here. Can you talk yourself about some of the obstacles while we have more talk and action, and maybe kind of weave in what the role of policymaker could be in there?
Yeah, absolutely. And Amal, you started off this particular section by saying you're going to be provocative. I don't think you're being provocative at all. I think this is just a subject matter that those of us who really care, and if you want to be found on the right side of history, 20 years, 30 years from now, this is a conversation we just have to be having. Policymakers are one aspect of it. Of course, the private sector, Phyllis has spoken to very, very well. But I also want to just add to what Phyllis has said, that we need to unlearn FIs, DFIs, whatever form or shape you are as an intermediary. And the word leadership, I think we should not underestimate. At the top of our institutions, we need to unlearn and rebalance our perceptions of risk. And so financial risk is what we have all been trained, it's in our DNA to assess and to look out for. But social risk, which is what we're facing today and why we are having this conversation today, can very quickly manifest into financial risk. So I think we should not separate the conversation of risk. It's a component, it's integrated, and we need to understand and own that and be sure that we understand it for what it is. And there are things that are happening out there, but from a policy perspective, to your particular question, Betty, Amal, I think that these conversations, I hope the next conversation roundtable we have like this is going to involve the leadership of the UBSs, of the CDCs, of the IFCs, of the ABSAs, as well as some policymakers on the other side, because it is a PPP. It's a PPP, and our policymakers need to listen, to embrace, and to facilitate. They need to acknowledge the global challenges. I think we talk about it. Phyllis mentioned earlier, there's a lot of talk, very little action. We talk about it, we do photo ops, but actually we don't own the outcome of this. And so for me, from a policymaker perspective, they need to reward and to support. They need to reward and to support thought leaders and leaders. So the new technologies that are coming out, the new entrepreneurs. They need to reward ownership. As I said, new entrepreneurs who are actually solutions-driven businesses. Most of your under 30s today are coming out with businesses that are designed to deliver a solution to a problem that exists, in addition to making money. Doing good, doing well at the same time. They should be rewarded. The fact that we don't understand that as a certain generation of policymakers should not stop us from embedding and creating an infrastructure for the future leaders of the global world. And thirdly, I think we need to reward and support innovation and the positive disruptors. The policymakers are at the central point of that. It is the integrator of what markets need and what markets do not have in order to make those needs a reality. And it's the policymaker who will benefit at the end of the day, because if this virtuous circle works, there will be taxes paid, there will be services provided, and through those taxes payments, it comes back to then implementing and investing in education, in health, in agriculture, in the underserved. And then finally, the point I would make about policymakers, as well as us as private sector, is let us not think small about impact investing. If you are doing a solar-powered factory of, I don't know, that's going to serve 1 million households, that's not a small project. The impact is huge. So we need to dispel this myth that impact means small, peripheral. We can think big and be impactful. And I like what Phyllis said about transparency in financial accounting. And if we have time, we can delve into that a little bit more. Thanks, Amal.
Thanks. I see a few questions coming, so we can maybe move already towards that. But kind of a quick reflection from my side. I think it's almost like in every transformation, be it of society or things, you have that side where the champion, the leadership, the people who kind of push as the front runners. And then at some time you need kind of the regulator, you need the policymaker, you need kind of to make, with the increase also transparency about the impact and to bring kind of those together for the bigger transformation. And sometimes it's just the hurdles are, I see it with the Education Outcomes Fund, the governments we work with, it's not that people don't want to do it, it's just like they have to actually put humongous effort to do it. We incentivize people to get money out of the door within certain budget cycles, and how can we incentivize them differently? It's also one of the key questions. But I'll invite my colleague Luna, who's been helping here in the shadow to the light, and maybe you can invite some of our participants here to join us and to join the conversation.
Yes, hi everyone. We've had some great questions. Please feel free to add some more either into the chat or to the Q&A. But I'll maybe invite some of the people who've asked the questions to ask them directly. So Katie, we've been in touch. I'm going to upgrade you so that you can ask your question. But before I do that, MS has said that they're running errands, so they're listening in. It might be a bit difficult for them to ask their question directly, so let me read it out. It says, how can we get FIs to actually own the development agenda and take the risk, especially in the sector that EOF focuses on? So Katie, so I'll just group some questions. I'll put a few out onto the floor. So Katie, I'm about to give you the floor. And Andrew Baird as well. I hope that you'll be comfortable me giving you the mic as well. Brilliant. Okay, I'll line you up for after Katie. Katie, are you there?
Katie's muted. I don't know if she can unmute her, if you need to unmute her.
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much for unmuting me, and thank you for what's already a fascinating discussion. My question today, I suppose, is given what you've all discussed here, how can we make sure that we're bringing the public sector in and making sure they understand how these new and innovative financial instruments add value and helping to maybe reduce their sort of fear or risk around those and get a more of an appetite from the public sector for these things?
Okay, thank you. Fantastic. Thank you for the question. We'll take a third one and then maybe we can cogitate over these three while other people put more. Yeah.
Yeah, so Andrew, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for hosting this. This has been really interesting so far. So my question was really aimed maybe at Phyllis to start with, but maybe others as well. And it has to do with the size of investments that are out there and looking for a place to go. And what we've observed in speaking with other colleagues is that very often there's some mismatch, and the organizations that are implementing have been set up for, as Amel was saying, kind of smaller scale, always looking to scale up, and the investments are usually larger, and it's very difficult for these organizations to absorb them. So kind of speaking maybe a little bit about that mismatch and maybe what the ideal sizes of these investments are.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. So we have three questions, and who would like to go first? Not both at the same time there.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm happy to take, I'll take a couple of them around the public sector and then the mismatch between what's needed and what organizations can absorb. So on the public sector side, we have to get the public sector engaged, absolutely. And this is so compelling for them. It just baffles me that they would not be engaged. For instance, in the US, we know that, and this is probably, this is a few years old, but something like 800 billion is spent on human service programs from federal government, state government, local government, yet we have knowledge of impact of less than 1% of that. And I mean, this is a huge opportunity for governments to finance things that are outcome based, so that we have, we as taxpayers know that our money is being used impactfully. And especially when you look at development aid from Western governments, particularly, they're under great pressure right now. We're seeing across the globe countries, because of the pandemic, saying, sorry, we can't afford to give as much as we used to give to international aid. And so we really need to focus on the quality of that money. And it's always been focused on the number, how much are we giving? What percent of GDP? Well, that's no longer the question. The question should be, what is the impact? What is the greatest impact we can have with our resources? So I think we have to change the conversation. So that's the first thing. And then to answer the question about the investment size and the mismatch, yes and no. Yes, we hear, in impact investing too, that there's a pipeline problem. But, when you have people on the ground meeting with and talking with local community organizations, there are a lot of organizations out there that need a lot more money. And one way to do this is to pool them together. So I can't say much about it right now for legal reasons. We're not allowed to market things before they're out. But, the sizes of deals that we've done so far, it started at 250,000 USD. It's gone up to about 20 million. Maybe 50 million, but these are going out to a number of different organizations. But something that we will be launching shortly is closer to the 200 million range, and it will be investing in a pool of organizations. So it's not just giving the money to one organization, but bringing together a number of organizations to address, for instance, the issue of improving the quality of education in particular regions. And there's a lot of organizations working towards that goal. And frankly, creates a little bit of competition. We did a development impact bond in India where we had 4 organizations striving for similar outcomes, which is improved learning. And some of them did much better than others, and they all had different models. So you can then start to see, what works best. And, these organizations learn they don't want to go out of business. So maybe they merge, or maybe they adopt their model to something that's more impactful. So I think the best way then to address the resource issue is to try to pool a number of organizations together, and that's what we're doing now. But clearly, we need more money to do this, and I think there are sufficient organizations out there.
Fantastic, thank you, Dolika. Would you like to comment on a few of the questions?
Yeah, and I think I'd like to just piggyback on Phyllis's last comment, which is around pooling finances as opposed to looking at a deal by deal transaction approach. And when I think about it, there are so many. The deal size conversation, to I think it was Andy's the comment. The deal size conversation has been a conversation for a long time, but I think it's because it's a conversation we hold in the same circles, the DFI circles, the sort of big bank circles, where they're saying at $10 million, the admin costs of doing a deal is not worth it. It's got to be just above that. You've got a lot of funding now that is out there. And one of the things, I know this is supposed to be a closing comment, your last thoughts, Amel, but one of the things that I think this organization is well placed to do is to find those organizations that are ready to go down the size spectrum. And there are many that are asking me, do you know a $2 million deal? Do you know a $500,000 deal? But we don't have reach to them, easy reach. We know the usual alphabet soup. And so I think there's an opportunity here to actually put out those platforms that are looking for the smaller size deals, the more impactful deals, however you define that in your world. But having said that, let me go to the sort of the relationship between the private sector and the public sector and the role of FIs. I think that FIs, of intermediaries, I won't call them banks, but institutions, but intermediaries, have a huge role to play. And I repeat this all the time. Those of you who've heard me speak before will be totally bored of this conversation. But when we wanted microfinance to become mainstream, it was the intermediaries that did it. When we wanted SMEs to become mainstream, it was the financial intermediaries that did it. Now we are looking for green bonds and climate-related transactions and structures, innovative structures that are going to deliver a solution that is a social solution. Again, we're back to the financial intermediaries. So I think as financial intermediaries, we should, in my old Citibank days, stop saying, can we do this? Rather, how can we do this? But it's got to have buy-in at the top. And that buy-in for me comes, if I can put out just a couple of points that I'd like to leave with the conversation today.
One, maybe can you save these because we'll have a closing round, Dolika.
Sure. Okay,
because we'll take some few more questions and go to a closing round later. But thank you for this impulse, because we've just to say, I think Emily Gustafsson, right? I think she's also in the attendees. So hi, Emily. And we've wrote together with her and Max and a blog lately, which talks about a new form of PPP. So, PPPs traditionally have been private-public partnership, and we call them now partnership for public purpose, because basically the center should be the purpose, what we want to achieve. And also it's not just about private and public, because the third sector, NGOs, NPOs, academia, media, etc., we need a much larger coalition to kind of achieve results in those global challenges, education, health, and others, employment that we encountering. So maybe Emily would add the link, or someone in the team can add the link there, because I think I think it's one for me of the answers. How can we get governments to embrace this? I think governments have to learn to do new forms of partnership. We know how to do this, to build bridges maybe, or airports or infrastructure. But how can we really work together between government, financial institutions, NGOs, etc.? And I agree with you, Dolika, about the role of intermediary, because completely different languages, and you need, in a perfect world, they would understand each other, but we are not in that perfect world. So kind of how can we play that role of bridging, I think is important. But let's take a few more questions, Luna.
Yep, sure. So we've had questions from Mariam and Betty and Yosri. So unless you say otherwise, I'm going to give you each the floor to ask your question as probably the last set of questions that we'll have time for today. So let me go to Betty first. Betty, you there? Feel free to unmute. Hi.
Yep, I'm joining together.
Hi, Betty. We hear you.
You can hear me, but not see me. Okay, here we go. So this is me. Hi, I'm in Zambia.
Oh.
It's cold. Well, it's cold for Zambia. So my question really has to do with, I'm working with an organization called EFIT, and it looks at the questions of how do we finance change in transition countries, and also how do we address peacemaking and things of this nature. And in the process of the discussion, the teams have been coming up with ideas about the problem with financing arrangements is that they're too expensive. And they're expensive both to set up, and they're also expensive to implement and manage the rules managing the financing. So this group says, well, why are we doing it directly? Why don't we have a pool of funds where if you want to look at an investment, this pool can be used for an organization to look at your funding option, and also to help whatever organization is managing it to implement and manage the funding. So it's a third-party player. And in that way, the group doesn't have to learn about all the rules of every single donor, which I'm facing myself. And also that they have a player who's the advocate on both sides to address the questions of, the spend and the implementation and any challenges. And it leaves the actual implementer of the program to get on with it and get the job done. So my question is, what does the panel think about this idea? Is it feasible? If so, why are we not talking about doing it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Betty. Who should we go next to, Luna?
Great. So Mariam, Yosri, who would like to go next? I've made you both panelists, so you can just unmute and turn on your videos.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this great conversation. Well, my question is mainly about how can we push forward the gender agenda it's like, I mean, we're leaving behind half of the population. So what are the tools? How can finance for development, what is like its role, and how can we, like, are there any best practices? Are there any ideas on how to best proceed with that, especially in conflict or crisis settings? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you very much. Then let's go to Yosri.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
I just want to ask a question about how can we manage and balance between the private investment and the public investment? Thank you.
Okay, so we have the pooled funding. I think Phyllis, you talked a little bit about that already, but how also the gender question and this public versus private investing. So,
well, can I take take Yosri's question about public and private? Because I think that's really key. These are all great questions, but I think this notion of how do you use both of them to get more? And one way is using what we want to do. What's missing now is that we're not getting enough private sector investment in these critical issues affecting some of the poorest communities in the world. So how do we catalyze that? Ways to do that are to use the public funding to actually de-risk this and to help to stimulate greater private sector investment. So for instance, if you look at blended finance options, you could have models whereby governments provide the first loss to help catalyze, up to 10 times private sector investment. Or maybe it's the other way around. You use foundations and private sector money to catalyze government spend because private sector could take the risk, or foundations might be willing to take the risk and demonstrate the impact and resources saved, which governments always want, in order to catalyze it. So I think the two have to work hand in hand, and either one can catalyze funding from the other.
Thank you, Phyllis. Dalika, you want to talk about one of them?
Sure, and just for a specific example to Yosri's question, I think you have two people on the call that should be connected, which is Betty Wilkinson and Yosri himself, because Betty will have a good example of where in Zambia, a company called Prospero, which is a private sector oriented company, has actually partnered with FCDO UK and the Central Bank of Zambia and Ministry of Finance to do exactly what Phyllis is talking about: credit enhancement, de-risking. So encourage this community also to talk to each other and learn from those examples. On the gender issue that came from Mariam, I think the gender conversation has now become front and center for all of us. It's truly just a question of how do we maximize where we have reached with the conversation. There's a lot of money out there. I mentioned the 2X challenge a little bit earlier, but it's not the only one. Almost every investor that is an emerging market investor, and you mentioned conflict afflicted countries, the gender agenda is on the agenda. So maybe it's a separate conversation, Mariam, where we can pick it up. I'm quite happy for you to reach out to EOF to get my contact so that we can explore this. But it's there and it's on the table in a very big way. Betty, to the point on that delivery channels, I think is where we are at the moment. Everybody who has money is looking for credible delivery channels through which they can send their money. And they are looking for expertise in these areas. But what I always say with these things is that sometimes we self-censor. We have an idea and we assume the world out there is not going to pick that idea up, but there are many different ways of doing that. And so I think if you do have an idea, it's never easy. It's a tough conversation, but there are many investors out there that are ready to engage on this. And I also strongly suggest to use the Global Steering Group, which is now global and has national advisory committees in many countries, to find out how to pursue some of these ideas. It's a short time to explore all the possibilities, but all I'm trying to say is there is hope and we shouldn't give up.
Fantastic. I think on the gender thing, maybe it's something I can share we're doing now at EUF, is at least on the receiving end of the funds, is to use a multiplier. So basically we pay more for outcomes, learning outcomes, for example, of girls, both because, not only because in some areas they're harder to reach and it costs more, but even if it wouldn't in other areas, is because an educated girl just brings more back to society, has healthier children, has less children, has educated children, etc. And so we try, and that's something you can do easily with a financial instrument, because when you say, okay, I pay 1.5 for a girl or something like that, that's something that you translate into it. But I think on the other side also, for me, an important piece on the gender is also like the financial kind of education. And I've seen this, like, I take the example of Lagos in Nigeria. There's like this amazing number of private schools, which are not big international chains, which are like mom and pop schools. But I've talked to someone that they have probably kind of it's a $2 billion market probably, that you could give them loans and help them kind of, grow and deliver better learning, outcomes for the children. But there is no bank that would loan these people anything. So it's kind of there are also opportunities laying there, because people are not yet maybe as innovative and creative to say, my God, this is a $2 billion business. How can I set up a banking system or a financial institution system that could work with these schools and actually serve them and serve the community? And so there comes the question, what role can government play? What role can private sector play? What role can financial institutions play to kind of fill those gaps? And I think it's, for me personally, also a lot of removing kind of, I don't know, we could have questions. I don't know, do we have 1 or 2 more questions, or should we move to closing round?
There's only been one other question, and just because of the time, I'm going to read it out. And it's, how do grassroots organizations participate in this? Just final call for questions if anyone else has got any, but that's the last one I've seen.
Anyone want to comment on grassroots organizations?
Sure, I will take that. Grassroots organizations are critical to addressing these issues and the SDGs. And so first of all, become familiar with these mechanisms. And I see Emily's on the line from Brookings. Brookings has done a ton of great research around these types of new financing mechanisms. So become familiar, but don't go it alone. I would say partner with other smaller grassroots organizations and form a coalition of organizations that can present an offering to financial institutions. So work with others. But I think it's important that grassroots organizations start to get into the financing game, because hopefully we will see more money coming from this space.
And I think, we had a conversation recently with John Randall, who has been very outspoken about unrestricted co-funding. So there is, it's always the question, how can you bring organization to be investable, and unrestricted co-funding is one way where foundation can, support with some grant funding, with some co-funding organization to build the governance, to build, the leadership, to build the process and structure, so that they then can raise more of, let's say, more complex money, that in that sense. But that's kind of, I think, will lead us to another webinar that we could have, which is about, when you bring the third sector, I find when you go beyond the private public classic partnership, when you really want to make a partnership for public purpose that includes nonprofits, that includes social entrepreneurs, that includes young entrepreneurs, the question is, are we actually funding them in the right way? Is our funding undermining the impact we want to achieve? And I've been seeing this really day after day after day. And there it comes back, where are the intermediaries who help them to be able to achieve, to kind of get that funding. So they don't spend 80% of their time either writing monitoring reports. Most of the third sector is kept poor and professional. I mean, if you look, even the US, which is, which have some of the biggest, nonprofits in the world, you will probably never find very few who have more than $50 million revenue a year. You don't hear about merger and acquisitions, M&As between, nonprofits and NGOs. And so I think that I hope in the next years to see really a bigger change, that sector, which is really kind of contributing a lot to development and societal changes, can kind of be funded in a way that strengthen it and can help them play a bigger role. And I hope EUF, in our modest way, will contribute to that, because we're translating that unrestricted co-funding that you can't give if you use government money through the outcomes funding to offer at least that flexibility. But
I would just like to add 2 points to what you've just said. Sorry, very quickly.
Yeah, no,
one is not to underestimate the power of technology and innovation. We don't need to reach these markets the way we used to reach them traditionally, that they have to go over the threshold of a banking hall. That's one. I think the second is something that has been touted for many, many years, but seems to have subsided, and we need to bring it back to the table, which is the conversation around informal is the new formal. Nobody's going to fill out 10 pages, 20 pages of documents to get a $100,000 facility. So we've got to go back to that informal being the new formal, and how do we as a community support those communities who are already doing this. There are women groups that are doing investments, that are doing group lending. The old Grameen model has evolved and has become global. So we should be sure that we also do not throw the baby out with the bathwater and look back to those old things that were being done, but also technology and innovation. Very powerful.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the great question. I see also great comments on the chat. We're coming to end. We want to end on time. And so my last question to you two would be, kind of the glass, crystal ball question. When you look ahead, what is the future of social finance? What is your horizon picture from this crystal ball? Maybe we start with Dolika and then go to Phyllis.
Thanks, Amel, and thanks to everybody for participating. For me, I'm a musical person. I love my music. So I will put this in the context of two pieces of music. One is African, the other is global. The first is Sarafina. And those of you who know Sarafina, this is the story. Tomorrow is Youth Day in South Africa, and I think we couldn't be having a more apt conversation than we are today. Sarafina is a story of the Soweto uprising in 1976 on the 16th of June, where students who had been a quiet, inaudible voice suddenly erupted into this crescendo of action that changed the landscape of South Africa and the future of South Africa, and the inclusiveness and the social disparities were still not there, but it was the beginnings. So it started inaudibly, but it became this loud voice that nobody could ignore. My second piece of music is Maurice Ravel's Bolero. Again, those of you who know Bolero, it starts very inaudibly, and then it rises to this crescendo where you really have to stand up and say, my goodness, we have to listen to this song. Some called him mad, and he said it was great that they considered it mad because it was something that he wanted to do around a single theme. So the music is the same, it just rises in the noise. The focus and the theme is the same. I say the same about impact investing. I say the same about outcomes-based financing, which you are doing, Amel. I say the same about equality, inclusiveness, gender, youth, all of these things. The time has come. We can't ignore it. And so I'm very hopeful. The challenges are there, but nothing good ever came without challenges. And those would be my last words.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dolika. Thank you for those inspiring words. So Phyllis.
Well, I'll stick with the music theme since Stolika started it. It's similar to Sam Cooke. A change is going to come. Starts out very slow, then you get the French horns coming in, and then you've got other wind instruments and string instruments, and it grows really loud. I think we are at a point now where, as Stolika said, social risk is financial risk. Environmental risk, which used to be called externalities in the finance world, is now a real, environmental issues are a real financial risk. So the time is now. Financial institutions have to pay attention to these social risks. You know, we know that we are as strong as our weakest healthcare system. This has taught us that. And, you know, a disease somewhere is a risk everywhere. And we have seen that firsthand. And I think financial institutions and wealthy individuals are stepping up because they know now that this isn't going to be the last time this happens. And we've got to pay attention to these issues. And we're seeing a huge change in expectations from societies too. They expect businesses to stand up. I know at UBS right now, all of our senior managers now for the very first time have in their performance goals, sustainability goals, financing the SDGs. And we've identified a few SDGs that are key to us as a firm, including education as one of them. And I don't think we're going to be the first bank to do this. I think a lot of other financial institutions and corporations are going to start weaving this in to how they conduct business. So I think that the time is now. We've built up to that crescendo, and hopefully change is going to come.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'll leave everyone with this hope. You know, I talked about the G0 world, but there are people who talk about the G7 billion world, you know, that the power is not anymore within a few, and that leadership is not just among the top, that we need kind of this movement and many young people are part of this movement to push forward. So really happy to have been talking with two women who, for me, have been part of the movement and have been supporting us and supporting me personally also to persevere through all the obstacles. And on this musical note and on time, I say thank you, everyone, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.